Welcome to this episode of Inside Legal ESG. I'm so pleased to have with us today Natalie Runyon, the ESG content strategist for the Thomson Reuters Institute, and she covers the professions, both the legal profession and the accounting profession. So welcome, Natalie. We're so excited to have you with us today.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
So I'm going to dive right in here. So in covering ESG for the professions, what are you seeing in the marketplace?
So in short, there's a lot of activity going on, but let me give you some examples or data points that help demonstrate the breadth and the depth of the activity. So number one, public companies are asking their suppliers for greenhouse gas information in anticipation of the SEC rules based on the date of this recording, which is early March. And because law firms are part of public company supply chains, they need to be thinking about how they are going to calculate and report their own greenhouse gas emissions. So that's one. I would say another thing that I'm seeing is that there's ongoing politicization of ESG, mainly in the US. And the headlines you see are mostly focused on in the finance world. But this issue is actually impacting law firms in quite a unique way. Law firm leaders are increasingly caught in the middle between activism coming from employees, clients, and politicians on one side of a hot button issue, and another group of clients who may be on the opposing side. So for example, we've seen corporate clients that are leaning into ESG actions and also expecting their suppliers to do the same. But in the last couple of months, we've actually seen a small group of members of Congress warn law firms about a quote unquote collusive effort to restrict fossil fuels. So that means law firms need to really proceed with introspection and caution and think through the process that if, when, and how to respond, that they really do so that's aligned with their values and really looking hard at the values lens and how they're going to respond. From a business standpoint, litigation risk remains a top concern for companies. And so for law firms, obviously that's a business opportunity from greenwashing claims, or more widely what you're starting to hear is sustainability washing claims. And then more broadly than the legal industry, companies are struggling with the resource constraints in terms of the time, effort, and investment that is required to create and execute an ESG strategy in perpetuity, because this is not going away. The ESG issue is going to be here to stay with us. And so let me kind of just close out with framing the impact of ESG when I spoke with a law firm's head of ESG practice. He framed it in this way, that he believes ESG regulation will surpass that of Sarbanes-Oxley and Dodd-Frank in terms of total investment for companies. That's quite a remarkable prediction. And everything that I'm seeing would start to suggest that he's going to be right.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. ESG is not going to go away. I predict that eventually it'll just be embedded in the way we run our businesses and the way we practice law. But right now it's something new and emerging, and so it's a little separate. But I think eventually it'll be immersed in just the normal business of things. With all of this recent activity, and recent, I'm talking about 2 to 3 years, this has sort of come to fruition. Tell me how this got assigned to you. When did you start covering ESG for the professions?
So I started covering ESG about 9 months ago, but and it was really because Thomson Reuters customers started asking us about ESG and looking for some help in how they should start creating a strategy. And that kind of harkens back to the first role that I had as a content strategist for the Thomson Reuters Institute, when I was covering talent, inclusion, and culture topics for the legal industry. And then a couple of years later, tax and accounting was added. So when our customers from Thomson Reuters started to ask for help in this space, and there was a decision made that we needed to start covering it as a thought leadership issue. And so out of all the team members, because I was already in covering inclusion and equity and diversity, it just made sense because DEI is such a huge part of the S.
Yes.
As it relates to the social part of ESG. So it just made sense to assign me the activity.
Lucky you, right?
It's been really a very interesting space to cover and to learn about, for sure.
And it's so quickly evolving that, I've been working in this space for 5 years and I'm not bored yet, right? Because every day there's something new. Tell me about what you're seeing, because I always think there's two sides to the ESG coin when it comes to the profession. One is serving their clients. So law firms and accounting firms, what do we need to know about ESG in order to better advise our clients? And then the second is, what do we as an accounting firm or a law firm, what do we need to do ourselves? Because we're a business. So tell me what you're seeing on both sides of those coin when it comes to serving clients and when it comes to running their own business.
Yeah, so let me start with the service line or the revenue generating aspect of that first. So a lot of firms have established practice areas, and there's also a lot of firms who are interested in exploring ESG as a new practice area. Something that firms with multiple practice areas that don't always see is that if they are a multidisciplinary firm with multiple practice areas, for example, labor and employment, if they have a practice where they're advising corporate boards on governance issues, if they have a cybersecurity practice or a regulatory and compliance practice, those are essential foundational elements of an ESG practice. So, and a lot of firms don't really understand that until they start looking at the broad scope of issues that comprise of ESG. We are seeing that firms who don't have established ESG practices are interested in exploring it, but many don't know where to start. So if I was advising a firm on where to start, I would say to look at your existing practice areas and identify the specific issues within the E, the S, and the G where you already have existing business serving clients and start to build from there. So that's what I would say about the revenue line. Focusing more on the internal strategy, what we're seeing is there is a lot of activity there as well. And we kind of see law firms in two different camps. So for their own internal ESG strategies, there are some firms who saw that this was going to be a mainstream issue. And so a couple of years ago, made the decision, mostly based on feedback from their talent, or just because it was important to someone in the leadership to do that, and it was important to the law firm's values, that they started to create their own ESG strategy and focus on their internal efforts a couple of years ago. But there's also a lot of firms that have heard of ESG, but really don't know what it means for the legal industry. And so they're going to be quite surprised, I think, when they as they see more and more clients start to ask for information about their own internal strategy. And so there's law firms who don't really know where to start and how to start to create a strategy, through a materiality assessment. So I think those firms are going to be looking to do that here in 2022. And I think that that's going to be an increasing need for law firms internally to develop their own strategy as we go through 2023 on through 2024 and beyond.
And you mentioned, I completely agree. And you mentioned something in the very beginning about law firms being part of their client supply chains. And the important thing to note there is so many law firms say, oh, well, we're not a public company, so these SEC regs don't apply to us, or we don't have to disclose certain things because we're not a public company. But to your point, clients need that information from their large vendors and suppliers. And in many cases, a large vendor and supplier is their legal counsel. Are you seeing, tell me more about what you're seeing in that space, client expectations of their law firm's own ESG performance?
I mean, all the folks that I talk to at law firms who are either heads of sustainability for the practice area or internally of the firm strategy are saying that they're starting to get these requests more and more from clients. Right now, the scope 3, which is the part of the SEC regulation that is focused on the supply chain, is voluntary, right? But we're expecting at some point that that the SEC may mandate Scope 3 reporting at some point, or there's going to be increased pressure and expectation for major suppliers to report, in this case, greenhouse gas emissions. So I think based on that, we will start to see a acceleration of those requests coming in. And it kind of is like the history of how much ESG has gained momentum over the last decade, right? I mean, we didn't start hearing about greenhouse gas emissions as a mainstream issue until a couple of years ago. And now that acceleration in terms of expectations for public companies to report greenhouse gas information and other E-related issues is almost mandatory. Most of the Fortune 500, I think, is actually doing it on a voluntary basis. And with these SEC regulations, that's just going to mandate it, and it's going to accelerate a lot of activity, as we've seen. And so I anticipate the same happening with the supply chain of public companies.
I completely agree. And I like the phrase you use, voluntary, because you could put that word in quotes for law firms. Because if your clients are disclosing, whether it's voluntarily or, eventually required by the SEC, law firms aren't really going to have a choice. It's not a voluntary thing for them, because their clients are going to say, hey, we need this information from you, or at a very minimum, we expect this certain behavior from our vendors and suppliers, not unlike, the DE&I expectations from clients or the data security and privacy expectations from clients. There are certain thresholds of behavior and conduct that they expect from all their vendors and suppliers, and law firms are not immune from that at all.
Yeah, I was going to make that parallel with DEI information. 7 or 8 years ago, it was almost uncommon for any company to be asking that information of their law firms. And now it's a standard expectation through the procurement process.
Yeah. And I think procurement plays a huge role in this, because they're standardizing things that used to be, for lack of a better description, sort of good old boy network. I know you from the golf club, so I'm going to hire you to handle my legal work. Whereas now procurement has a much more rigorous structure and format to how their outside vendors are selected, including. Yeah.
And if you think about the company's perspective, right? Take a manufacturing company or a retail company that is going to have thousands of suppliers. If they have to collect all of this information from all of their key suppliers, that is a data nightmare. Right. And so they're going to be using their procurement processes to mandate the type of information, how to calculate the information. And so that's why it's really important for the SEC rules around Scope 3 to come up with some common methodology. So law firms don't have to calculate their greenhouse gas emissions, for example, 20 different ways, depending on what the client's preferences are,
That's right. I completely agree. So what are you seeing in the marketplace? What are firms getting right with respect to their offerings to clients? Oh, you're muted, Natalie. There you go.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
So what are firms getting right about their offerings? I think most people that I speak with who are ESG experts in law firms initially were exposed to a particular issue around ESG with one client asking for advice on a specific ESG issue. That's how it started. And then once the practice helped a client with a specific issue, it opened the door for those in the practice area to start having conversations with other clients in similar or the same industries about what they are doing to address the issue. They could start asking their clients proactively, right? Mm-hmm. So what I think firms are getting right is that they are starting very focused and then building from there. Firms are not trying to boil the ocean. They are strategic in what ESG issues that they are pursuing in the early stages. And like I said before, if a firm has a labor and employment practice, there are a number of different ESG issues that the firm could use to expand its practice around ESG. Just within the S, you have labor standards, working conditions, employee benefits, employee relations, human capital management, and health and safety, to name the few. And just like if a firm has a practice on advising boards of directors, there are areas within the G that fall into the category, including board and executive oversight, executive compensation, shareholder rights, and board independence. If the firm has a cyber practice, data privacy is a big governance issue. And finally, if a firm has a compliance and regulatory practice, it will be involved in some substantive issues around the G as well. So those are just some ideas for how a law firm could start to focus on one area and then build from there.
Those are absolutely great ideas. And to start with existing clients is key. It's not a new practice area where you have to go out and find new clients, because every law firm has a whole stable of clients that need these services and need this help. You've mentioned a couple of times the different contact people with respect to ESG within a law firm. Yes, there's the people, the lawyers who are running the practice. But what are you seeing with respect to staffing the ESG function at law firms for the business itself? You mentioned earlier that this is just a data intensive role. So it's not something necessarily that somebody can put on the side of their desk and expect it to get done. What are you seeing? Are law firms hiring for this role? Are they forming internal teams? And what type of position?
So I think if you are part of the Global 100, you probably have at least a part-time person who has sustainability in their role, or a full-time dedicated head. For other law firms who are smaller, I'm not seeing full dedicated headcount or roles yet, but I think that's a yet. We just started seeing directors of diversity, equity, inclusion about 5 years ago. And now that's pretty standard across the AmLaw 100 for sure, if not the 200. And then we started seeing that role elevated to the chief position. And so I would say that I would expect the same thing to happen around ESG and sustainability. And the key driver of that is going to be the client requests. And I think with the increasing regulation coming from the SEC, there are additional regulations that have been enacted in other jurisdictions, particularly within Europe and the EU, that are going to be reporting requirements are going to be coming online in 23 and 24. And I think all of this is going to add to a multiplier effect in the creation of full-time roles, because law firms are going to start getting asked that they need to report on information around ESG as part of the procurement process of clients. And so I think that's going to be the big driver there. So that's what I'm seeing.
And you use the analogy of the DE&I director and now chief diversity officers. I would say the same thing with data security. Remember when data security was just a checkbox exercise, and then pretty soon that was insufficient to meet client expectations. And so then there was a data director, and now there's, chief security officers at a lot of law firms, or knowledge management or whatever, to fill that role in order to make sure we're meeting client expectations.
That's exactly right.
So we're close to running out of time, but I have two more questions for you. One is, what is your prediction with respect to the SEC regulations? That's a big question, isn't it?
Yeah, that is a big question. So I think there's no doubt in my mind that the rules are going to be mandated for scope 1 and scope 2. I think scope 3 is a question mark. It may remain voluntary for some amount of time, but I think once it becomes a little bit easier, and once there are more maybe technology tools, and there's a common methodology, there's increased alignment across the different frameworks of standards and reporting, once that's simplified, and I think that'll happen over the next 36 months, I think we'll see that become, if it's not mandated, it's going to be an expectation.
Yeah, I often say it almost doesn't matter what the SEC does with respect to scope 3 because the stakeholders expect it. So I put voluntary in quotes. While it may remain voluntary for a while, if your clients are expecting it, or your recruits or your employees or your communities or your stakeholders are expecting disclosure, companies are going to have to do something. And waiting for the SEC to make it mandatory is not necessarily the best path to go down.
Yeah, and in particular in the US, I think the one caveat that I would add is if there is a change in administration in 2024, that is going to be a key outcome to watch, because depending on which way it goes, you could have some reversal in that space for sure.
Yeah, I completely agree. So ultimate question, if we were to talk again in a year, what do you think will have changed in the ESG world for law firms and accounting firms?
I think we might start to see full-time roles dedicated to ESG and helping to drive the firm's internal ESG and sustainability strategies. I expect there to be more regulation for sure across jurisdictions across the world. I think if the federal level doesn't see regulation in the US, states will start to take action themselves. I also think that there will be convergence in the frameworks, because right now I think that's the biggest impediment to progress, is because a lot of companies are having to pick these certain elements from this framework and this and other definitions and standards from another framework. So as you see convergence there, I think it'll be simplified. And so those are some of the indicators of success and some activities that I think will happen over the next year. So I'm hoping by this time next year, if we don't have some clarity, we'll start to have some tea leaves that would indicate that clarity and progress continue in that way.
And those would all be very good things if we actually get there in a year. So I definitely will have you back for a podcast guest a year from now, and we will talk about whether these predictions have come true. I hope they will, and I agree with everything that you've mentioned. Thank you so much for your insights today. They've been incredible, and hopefully the law firms and accounting firms that are listening will understand that it's time to get started on this journey. And even if you don't know exactly quite where to start, ask your clients. They'll be happy to guide you because they're already on this journey. Thank you so much, Natalie.
Thank you for having me. It's been my pleasure.